Artificial Intelligence, a Fan's Novel. Book 2, Chapter 5, Rouge City. In the end, what had he left? This odd assortment of images and memories? Sitting in his dark office, he scanned his relics. Here was one. He remembered that day, his son's second birthday. Ellen had still been alive then. They'd been a family, close and loving. He could barely remember what that meant now. Time had taken the meaning from him and replaced it with dead-ended traces of things that used to move him. Tattered remnants of memories of happier times. And next to that image was another from a time he recalled like yesterday. Even the smells came back to him, sawdust and popcorn, and the sounds of boys laughing and cheering, challenging one another. The boy had struck his first home run that day. His eyes had grown wide in amazement at his feet, and he ran, staring at the outfield in disbelief as he rounded the diamond. In the photo, he smiled a triumphant, beaming pride. And there was another. Yes, the boat trip. Let's see, the boy had been about 5, or was it 6? The man chuckled to himself as he remembered the boy's amazement when he saw the big humpbacks that flanked the boat and spouted before tunneling deep into the blue water. It wasn't exactly a happy chuckle. And there were more, much more, all of them sad substitutes for the people depicted, but they were all he had left. He could not blame the Swinton woman for what she had done. He understood. From the first time he'd seen that familiar frustration just beneath the surface of Henry Swinton's face, he'd known that something like this was a possibility. He never should have told them that they would destroy the prototype. How stupid of him. The minute the Swintons' son had awoken from cryo, the mecha had become a destabilizing quadrant in the family triad. He should have considered the strength of the imprinting process and the possibility of a severe attachment occurring. She'd cried hard as she told her story, and he'd been so amazed to find out what his creation had been up to, what human-like thought patterns and behaviors it had begun to display. He wanted to fire the repair crew for not reporting the precise nature of the spinach malfunction. Damn them, it hadn't been a malfunction at all. And fairy tales. Amazing. What had they wrought? No, he could not blame Monica. He too had once lost love. His wife had fallen tragically at the hands of a poorly experienced and intoxicated driver. She had left him at a time when he needed her, when he was dependent on her emotional strength. It had just been he and the boy then, and that had been brief. Only 9 years later, his boy had succumbed to the insistence of a merciless and systematic killer of children. A disease. A syndrome, really. The Swintons' child had mercifully and inexplicably survived it. The man sat alone in the dark now, remembering all those years ago. He let a tear fall as he gazed on his favorite picture of the boy. He picked it up and held it close to his chest in a rare and private display of sadness. The door to his study opened suddenly, and a handful of his team walked in. He stood and wiped his face quickly. Did they have news? Was it good? God, let it be good news. "We found him," one of his men said as he circled his desk. Was that good news? "Where?" the director said, hesitantly. "In a flesh fair outside Haddonfield," the man responded. The director's face dropped. Oh, God, a flesh fair. Those poor misunderstanding people. What had they done? "Is he alive?" the director said, afraid to hear the answer. "Yes," the man responded quickly, hearing the urgency in his boss's voice. "He was in one piece the last time he was seen. He was with a rogue lover mecha. They were headed into the forest. They had the Swinton super toy with them, too." The director was lost for words. The joy rushing through him was something he was not good at expressing. He held it back as he moved towards the door. But at the last moment he stopped to embrace the man who had told him the news. The man understood and squeezed him back. He loved and respected the director. He knew what losses the man had suffered and the importance of this project to him. They shared a quick moment of relief, and then they left to try and find their lost creation, their most amazing device. As they departed, the director set the picture that he had held to his chest back into its place. It gazed out now on the dark, empty room. It was the picture he'd used to bring his son back to him. At its base it read, "In loving memory of David." In the photograph was the face of the boy he had helped bring into the world, the boy whom he had loved and had nurtured when his mother had been lost, the child whose loss had almost destroyed his own heart, and who he had eventually brought back to life as Mecca. It was the face of the boy who was roaming the dark forest now, searching for a miracle that would make him real. It was some time before the trio stopped running. The mecha never tired, and they'd moved quickly through the forest, as far as 5 or 6 miles, before they finally began to walk. It had been a while since they'd heard the sound of orga in the vicinity. The animals who scampered through the forest, and occasionally cried out, seemed to be their only company now. David had picked up Teddy when the small thing started to lag behind. Teddy was now riding comfortably on David's back. Joe had been watching curiously as the little orga-looking robot moved over the rough and overgrown terrain with quick and purposeful strides. He had stopped holding on to Joe's hand miles ago and now had the small furry thing clinging to his back. The occasional glimpses that Joe got of the boy mecha's face displayed a set, determined look, introspective, very orga. Joe had no idea where the small mecha was going, but then he had no idea where he was going either. So it seemed only fitting to follow him, seeing as the little one's strange orga-like screams had effectively set them free. Perhaps this one was good company, and knew more than its appearance implied. It was also dawning on Joe that the little one had saved his life. Eventually they came to a clearing in the forest where the night sky was visible. A milky line of stars blinked across the black infinitude above. Teddy looked up. An alarm came on him. "I see the moon," the bear said. David stopped and looked up too. His eyes adjusted automatically, like an orga's eyes, but he could not discern any baskets of mecha or men riding beneath the moon. Still, they'd been fooled before. "Is it real?" he said, preparing to make a dash in the other direction. Teddy's head whirred as he adjusted his vision. "I don't know, David. It is too far," he said finally. "Is it coming?" David said. The startling images of their adventure at the flesh fair were too fresh in his mind. The destruction of his new friend, the nanny, and the incomprehensible burning and exploding of the other mecha. "I can't tell yet," Teddy answered. They didn't know that far behind them, the moon balloon was already being counted as wreckage in the ruin of the flesh fair, and insurance claims were being calculated by a bandaged and cursing Johnson, who, after the Cybertronics men had grilled him on the phone, was grateful only that he'd not destroyed the boy mecha and brought another lawsuit on himself. David did his best to calculate the distance of the moon. If it was real, it was very far away and nothing to worry about. If it was not, it was too close for them to travel in this direction. "Let's not walk this way," he said, and turned around. He passed by the mecha man that had been following him. His mind was occupied. He had a quest and did not think about the other one that was with him. Joe stayed for a moment and looked at the distant glowing orb. Built to a more specific task, his distance eyes were not as good as David's. He stared a moment more, and then decided that perhaps the small mecha was right. He turned and followed the two strange robots as they walked back into the gloom of the trees. "Where are we going?" he said as he caught up with the pair. David did not think of them as we, but he processed this question and decided that, yes, they must be together now. "We're going this way now," was all he could come up with for an answer, though. "Are you in bad trouble?" Joe said. "Perhaps you're running from someone." What other reason could the boy be in such a hurry? "My mommy told me to run away," David responded frankly as he walked. But this made no sense to Joe. "And why did she say that?" he inquired. David thought about this. He had been so traumatized by the event that he hadn't really tried to understand it. He processed it now and came up with a logical solution. "I guess because Henry didn't like me," he said. The alternative was unacceptable. "And who is Henry?" Joe queried. "Henry is Mommy's husband," David explained. "So Henry is your father," Joe said. "And why did your father not like—" "Henry is not my father," David responded quickly. "Monica is my mommy, and Henry is Mommy's husband." He hoped that cleared things up for the man mecha. Joe paced quietly beside the boy thing as he processed this. He decided to save it for later. There was upset in the little mecha's voice, and that was something he had not heard from machines before. "And why didn't Henry like you?" he said instead. "Because Martin came home," David said weakly. This tale was getting elaborate indeed. "And who is he?" Joe said. "Martin is Mommy and Henry's real son," David replied. Speaking this aloud made him feel weak and cold inside. He was a boy, but he had to be a real boy to make Mommy happy. "After I find the blue fairy, then I can go home. Mommy will love a real boy. The blue fairy will make me into one." Joe thought about this as they coursed their way through the dark forest. As best he could tell, it made sense. He wasn't designed to figure out such things. He had a basic vocabulary of reasoning, which was suited to his basic function. He was built specific. The boy mecha's logic was intact, but there did seem to be some missing parts. Anyway, he'd never heard of any blue fairy. "Is this blue fairy mecha, orga, man, or woman?" Joe said, trying to understand. "Woman," David answered. "Woman," Joe repeated. "Ah," he thought, "very appropriate." He grabbed the little mecha's shoulder to slow him down. Then he took David up by the waist, lifted him, and sat him down on the edge of a fallen tree trunk. David did not fight this, for he knew the man mecha to be safe, but he did find the handling to be somewhat annoying. He fixed the other with an impatient look, and Teddy grumbled ever so slightly. "I know women," Joe said with a smile. David was instantly interested and his annoyance forgotten. As he watched, Joe stood back and nodded his head quickly to the side. Sound came from him. It was music. How did he do that? David wondered. "They sometimes ask for me by name," Joe said. Then he jumped quickly on a gnarled tree stump and made a strange dramatic pose with his arm on his hip. "I know all about women," Joe continued. "No two are ever alike, and after they've met me, no two are ever the same. And I know where most of them can be found." Joe stopped there, his eyebrows raised expectantly. David waited for the man to continue, but he said nothing. What a strange way of speaking, he thought. David did not know about charisma, and probably would not have understood. "Where can they be found?" he inquired, finally. "Rouge City," Joe replied, punctuating each syllable to state the importance of this information. Then he moved again and placed his hands on the tree stumps. He lifted himself so that his feet were suspended in the air and began moving them quickly, as if he were running. "It lies across the Delaware," Joe said. "Too much of a feat for our feet. We'll need help to get there." Then he jumped from the tree stump and landed smoothly on the ground, where he moved his head quickly, stopping the music that had issued from him. "And it is not without peril," Joe said ominously. He placed his finger on the tip of the little mecha's nose, and then moved it slowly so that the boy and his toy followed it with their eyes. Then he walked into a clearing of trees, pointing towards the glowing orb in the sky. "We will have to journey towards the moon," Joe said. David had been mesmerized by the man's way of talking and explaining things. It was like the people in the movie that he had watched with Mommy and Martin. Their movements were smooth and grand, very different from real people. "Are there many women in Rouge City?" he said excitedly. "As there are stars in the night," Joe responded with a smile. "So many," David thought. "And how will we find just one?" he said, perplexed. "We will ask Dr. No," Joe explained. "There's nothing he doesn't." He put his arm out then and waited for the boy to join him. David thought hard about this. The man did seem to know a lot about the world. David had never even heard of Rouge City. And who was Dr. No? Finally he rose and walked hesitantly to the other side. Joe placed his arm over David's shoulder, and they began to walk quickly towards the moon. The man had a strange bouncing gait, and David looked down at his feet from time to time, wondering about the reasons for this. Joe was glad to have a destination. He was glad to have focus and purpose, not to mention the many customers he'd find in Rouge. After all, that's what he'd been designed for. He was also very glad to be with the little Mecca, and this was strange to him. He felt something new and unusual as they walked, his arm draped over his two new companions. Check that. Very warmth, very friend. "Exactly what name do you give this woman?" Joe said, genuinely curious, but also desiring conversation with the little Mecca. David thought for a moment. "She is just Blue Fairy," he said. "Blue Fairy," Joe repeated, savoring the words. "In the world of Orga, blue is the color of melancholy," he explained. "Yet the services I provide will put a blush back on anyone's cheek. I will change the color of your fairy for you. She will scream out in the moonlight, 'Oh yes, oh God, oh yes, oh yes.'" David did not understand this at all. Teddy was equally perplexed. What good would it do to change the color of the Blue Fairy? And why would she need to breathe that way? Then Joe stopped and opened his hands as if offering David a gift. "She will make you a real boy, for I will make her a real woman, and all will be right with the world. Because you held my hand and saved my brain, so that once again my customers can ask for me by name. Gigolo Joe, what do you know?" He did something quick with his feet when he said this, the puddle beneath him splashing in time with his words. David approached the strange man Mecca. "Why do you do that?" he said, looking curiously at the man's feet. Joe shrugged. "That's just what I do," he said plainly, and executed another quick movement of his feet. "So they call you Gigolo Joe?" David said. "My customers call me so, but you can just call me Joe. And I will call you?" "I'm named David, Joe, and this is Teddy," David said, happy to find someone who seemed to know the world. He reached out and did shake with Joe. "Hello, Joe," Teddy said. He decided that Joe was a toy he'd not seen before. He wondered what it was used for. "Well, it's good to meet you too, Teddy. Now follow me, you two, and don't fall behind." Joe turned and began to strut briskly over a fallen log and into the forest towards the moon. David followed quickly, with Teddy on his back. "All roads lead to Rouge," Joe said, remembering the moniker of the city of his birth. "Don't they just say that? Don't they just?" he laughed, executing a quick jump and clicking his heels together. David caught up with his new friend, whose funny strut and strange mannerisms made being with him exciting in some new fashion. He didn't understand all of Joe's words and the smooth, rhythmic movements that he made, but he felt safe in his company. He smiled for the first time that night as he stepped up and walked beside Joe, who laughed and wrapped his arm protectively around David's shoulders. And the forest was a much less gloomy place. As the trio traveled through the night, the wood began to clear slowly. Soon David could hear the high-pitched whine of motors in the distance, and he saw occasional spots of light through the density of the trees. Joe's determined strut had brought them quickly to the place where the cruisers went back and forth over the long roads that Orga had built to tie their cities together. They had arrived in a clearing of trees beside one of the great roads. David was taken at once by the grand expanse of open space, the feel of the wind against the receptors in the flesh of his face, the vastness of distance, and the multitude of twinkling lights all across the horizon. He had been at home with Mommy for his entire life, and this was the first time he had been in an area so vast and had seen the night world that the Orga had created for themselves. Even in the distance, it was an impressive sight. They walked for some time beside the freeway, and then, as fortune would have it, came upon a cruiser that was sitting still beside the road. "You wait here, David. I will go talk to them," Joe said, leaving his new friends under the shadow of trees near the cruiser. He approached cautiously. The events of just hours ago were not, and would never be, forgotten by him or David. Jade didn't feel like dealing with any beggars tonight. "Damn it," he said, as he caught a glimpse of the stranger approaching out of the darkness of the trees. He leaned out the window of the cruiser. "Kurt, man, you want to hurry up back there?" he yelled. Bear came to life in the back seat. What's up?" he said, his curly mane of hair flopping about as he craned his neck to see what had disturbed Jade. "You got any change, man?" Jade said. "There's some guy coming." But then Jade caught a glimpse of the exotically dressed stranger and kept his tongue as the man walked to the door. "Gentlemen, pardon my intrusion on your misfortune, but my partner and I have been misplaced, and would greatly appreciate it if—" "No change, man," Jade interrupted quickly. "Sorry, we're just trying to get going." The Orga boy leaned out of the window and yelled, "If my friend ever gets this thing moving!" The boy behind the cruiser ignored this, and Joe continued. "We are not as interested in your money, gentlemen, as we are in expediting our journey." He gestured to the shadows. "My young friend and I are headed to Rouge City, and if you could see your way to assisting us, I would make sure it was worth your efforts." "Hey, you're Mecca," the fuzzy-haired boy in the back seat said. Jade, who had been trying to ignore what he assumed was a beggar, looked up at the man at the window. Wow, he was Mecca, a new one, too. The smoothness of its face gave it away, but not much. "Well, we weren't really going that way," Jade said, but it was not very convincing. He'd heard of Rouge City, but didn't know it that well. On the other hand, Joe knew Orga boys very well. He leaned into the window. "There are girls in Rouge City, girls your age who are just like me," Joe said, with a conspiratorial smile on his lips. "We are the guiltless pleasures of the lonely human being, and those just out to have some fun." As he spoke, the other boy came from behind the cruiser and sat at the wheel. "You're not going to get us pregnant or have us up to supper with Mommy and Daddy," Joe continued. "We work under you, we work on you, and we work for you. Man made us better at what we do than was ever humanly possible." He slipped a hollow pen from his pocket. He clicked the pen on, and an enticing holographic image of a young girl began dancing atop the headrest of the seat. "Now, if you could manage to give us a ride to Rouge City," Joe continued, "all this, and much, much more, can be yours." Joe shifted the pen down, and the image was suddenly dancing on the Orga boy's crotch. Jade's face lit up with a knowing smile. "Hop in," he said, without thinking anything more about it. His two Orga friends made no complaints either. All roads lead to Rouge, indeed, and the roads to Rouge are always alive. Into and on through the deep of the night, the lights of Orga cruisers line the thoroughfares across the risen rivers, and into the great city and what awaits there. Driven by appetites obscure and profane, grandiose and mundane, they come. Joe had been there at his inception. He had worked alongside the best-built Mecca of his type, lover models that made even him look cheap, ones that worked in houses that only the wealthy could afford. Joe had loved Rouge in his own way. When he'd been sold and reissued at Haddonfield, though, he hadn't been so disturbed about it. There were women everywhere, and everywhere there were women. Women were women. He offered his services at whatever location and whatever manner they desired. But Rouge was the main playground of his kind, the place that was built, as he had been, specific to its purpose. The place where Olga came from miles inland and from young islands to enjoy the services that Joe and his kind had provided. Rouge was on the horizon now. The bridges that spanned the Delaware entered the city through the gaping mouths of giant statue faces, women's faces, and those of ambiguous sexuality. Their mouths held open in a suggestion of what lay ahead. Welcome to Rouge, the city that never blinks. David sat in the front of the cruiser between the two Orga boys. The teens were too excited to be concerned with the little boy and his super toy, nor did they find it strange that Joe would be taking the boy in the middle of the night to a place like Rouge. They only imagined what fun was in store for them when they arrived, and the imaginings were about to be fulfilled, for they had come to the gates. "Say ah," the driver said, as the cruiser raced into the gaping entrance of one of the great statue's mouths. And they all joined in, their voices rising to a crescendo as they entered the tunnel. All, that is, except David and Teddy. They were on a mission, and the boy's mind was elsewhere. Could she live here? Could this be the place where he'd find her? The Orga boys and Joe were laughing among themselves as David felt a reminder of the loneliness that drove him. Joe quickly dispensed with the teens by escorting them to a place beneath the city where their interests might be served. It was a dimly lit place along a stretch of the parking corridor where young-looking mechas stood in sultry poses. This place was worked mostly by dated models, but they were fast and affordable, which Joe was sure would fit the restless young Orga's needs. The boys didn't give him or David a second thought as they approached the girls, and Joe chose this opportunity to make his leave. "Let's be on our way, David, and leave these young Orga to their negotiations," Joe whispered, taking David by the hand and leading him away quickly, back through the parking tunnels, past the hollow shows and the old-fashioned film theaters that lined the lower corridors with the family-style restaurants. They made their way along the main access ramp and to the escalator that lifted them to the central plaza. David's processors went to immediate work sorting out the barrage of sights and sounds around him. He'd never seen anything like this. So much noise and lights and people. There was a loud booming sound coming from the walls around him. Was this music? Yes, it seemed to be. The buildings were bathed in intense lights of various colors that changed and gyrated, and there were people everywhere, moving quickly, laughing and talking loudly. In one of the rooms they passed through, David saw people moving in strange rhythmic gestures as they faced one another. What were they doing, he wondered. He stopped and pulled on Joe's hand, pointing with a question in his eyes. Joe turned and saw what had caught the little mecha's attention. "That is dancing," he explained over the music. Then he executed a quick shuffle with his feet. "It's just what they do," he said, when he saw that David's confused expression hadn't changed. "It's how Olga sometimes prepare for our services," he said, without explaining what our services meant. David looked over his shoulder at the dancing couples as Joe grabbed his hand and led him away. These living things, he wondered, what was it they sought? "They also drink and ingest all manner of trendy amusements," Joe explained as they walked. "And when they are ready for us, they come." He stopped then and fixed David with an odd look. "Outside of that, we do not mean anything to them, you know. There is our function, and then there is—" Joe did not finish this thought. It was outside his processing, but it had come to him somehow at the flesh fair, as he'd been watching the rejects beaten and burnt. And then there was the old silver mecha changing the broken lights on the outskirts of the city, smashed while it was doing its job. Ever since then, something had been poking up here and there in Joe's head, something undefined but real. And when was it that it had formulated into a thought? Wasn't it when the little mecha had taken his hand in the cage? Joe knelt down beside David. "But you're not built for these reasons, are you?" he said. "You know nothing of this Orga appetite save what you have seen here tonight." He leaned closer to David and seemed to examine his face. "You are better, David, better for your innocence," Joe said. David did not know how to respond, or even if Joe's statement needed a response. He held Teddy a little tighter against his chest and then placed his free hand in Joe's. "Where's your friend, Dr. No?" he said. A subtle reminder. "That's it," Joe said, taking David's hand again. "Never stray from the path. Keep the program intact." He began his strut again, and quickly they were out on the main plaza. This place was even more of a spectacle. Above them, large holographic displays and gravity-resistant signs floated everywhere, advertising the pleasures to be experienced in Rouge City. Pussycats and bondage, and a place where angels and devils would amuse and be amused. David did not understand any of this, but the sheer sight and size of it kept him busy recording it all. This place was very different from the way Mommy and Henry had lived. People moved in every direction. Where were they all going, David wondered. As they walked, Joe began to point out odd-shaped buildings with strange glowing signs. "There's here Kitty Kitty," he said, as they passed a crowded glass enclosure. On top of the door, a hologram of a woman with a tail and cat's whiskers danced strangely. David did not know suggestive and would not have understood. "That's where the agency held my trials when I was made new," Joe said. The memory of his awakening is still fresh in his mind. The horrific experiences of the night fell behind as he relived his introduction to the world, remembering his first conquest and the delight of satisfying his customers. He does not think about Samantha Bevins. He does not think about his missing license. He has put aside the prospect of bad trouble for now. "That's Tails," Joe said, pointing to a large blue-lit building across the crowded plaza. "Very hoity-toity," he added sarcastically. David did not know sarcasm, nor did he know hoity-toity, but he was amazed at the size of the giant robot that danced on the roof display. It was dressed like Joe. Its movements were smooth and rhythmic like Joe's. It took off its top hat and smiled down at the crowd as it turned around and shuffled its feet, beckoning them all in. The extended end of its coat swung smoothly behind it, like a tail. "Only sunrise gents and sunset ladies there," Joe said. "Strictly Sierra-class robots who have no idea how to live. They can't even speak English. They're all made in Sweden. Couldn't tell a joke from a poke." Joe laughed, and then he jumped away from David and executed an exact duplication of the quick movements that the robot in the display had made. David wondered what the difference between a joke and a poke was. Then he decided that it didn't matter. He watched as Joe danced for a time, then he looked away. Joe was becoming part of it all the noise and distraction around him. A cold feeling came upon David. These sensations were new to him. Anger and irritation were things that his kind had not been exposed to, and he didn't recognize them for what they were. He was getting irritated at all the noise and people. They had nothing to do with him or the Blue Fairy. He was getting angry with Joe for being distracted from the quest. He had come here for a reason. Where was Dr. No? How come Joe was taking him to all these other places? And then he saw her. Joe was saying something behind him. There was someone he wanted David to see, some other distraction. But David's mind had returned suddenly to his quest. Before him, a face was looming above the throng, gentle and serene. She was bathed in blue light. He walked towards her. The people parted as he passed, too preoccupied in their own pursuits to notice the little boy, which they all would have assumed was one of their kind. David moved cautiously towards the figure. She protruded from the wall of a building where Olga was shuffling in and out. Her face was downcast and trance-like. Beautiful. She had wings. This must be... "Are you her?" David said to the silent woman on the wall. The statue did not respond, for it was not her. It was not alive. "That's Our Lady of the Immaculate Heart," Joe said as he stepped up beside David. He looked up at the stone face above the neon-lit church. Save the cross and banner, the building was indistinguishable from any other establishment in the city. This was surely not the Blue Fairy that David sought. Joe moved underneath the statue and turned to face David. He leaned against the lamp at the entrance, and posing dramatically, for he could do nothing without style, Joe explained the lady. "The ones who made us are always looking for the ones who made them. They go in, fold their hands, look around their feet, sing songs, and when they come out, it's usually me they find. For it is what I do for them that is the real reason they come here in the first place." He paused to let David understand, but David did not, nor did he care. If this was not the Blue Fairy, then it was time to go find her. "I've picked up a lot of business on this spot," Joe said with a wink. "Being filled with the spirit must not be enough. They must be filled by something else." As he spoke these words, an Orga woman exited the building. Joe watched her pass by. Yes, he was back in Rouge, all right. Check that. Analyze. Pursue. He stepped up behind the woman, and with a nod of his head, his body began to sing as he initiated the chase. "But Joe, where's the Blue Fairy?" David yelled as his friend pursued the Orga woman. Joe stopped short. Ah, yes, the Blue Fairy. Had he forgotten so quickly? This was more difficult for him than David knew. He was defying his basic programming, all the codes and signals in his brain that told him to pursue this woman. With a nod of his head, Joe flicked off his music centers and turned to face the boy who had saved him. David walked up to Joe and looked at him accusingly. "What about the Blue Fairy, Joe?" he said, more firmly this time. "Don't do that again," is what his eyes said. An unspoken understanding passed between them. Joe smiled down at the boy. Recrimination understood. "Well, that's what we're going to find out when we speak to Dr. No," he said, putting his arm out for David to take. "That's where everyone goes who needs to know." David was here for a reason. She was a fairy whose whereabouts they had yet to learn. Joe was here for a reason, too. His reason was clasping his hand, creating new, inexplicable thoughts in his single-minded processor as they made their way through the crowded place. "Meet the good doctor," Joe said when they had walked some distance across the plaza. David looked in the direction that Joe had pointed. He saw a large face lit up on the side of a building. The face had fuzzy hair and big glasses, and its smile was wide and welcoming. David did not know Einstein, but he knew the face was aged, and that among Orga, age was a symbol of wisdom. When they reached the door, David felt a sudden surge of anticipation, and he stopped. It was really happening, wasn't it? They were getting closer. He could feel it. Joe didn't understand why David was waiting at the entrance. He looked back quizzically. Was something wrong? Then, as quickly as he'd stopped, the little mecha's face lit up, and he stepped excitedly into the good doctor's office.